Welcome. You are in our 24th year of bringing recognized foreign policy experts speak to us on world events and challenges to U.S. foreign policy. Of course, we have none of those. We are nonpartisan, and our views presented by the speakers are theirs. Uh, Joining me on our team, if you'll just wave, Tyler Beebe, Amy Friedman, Naomi Marrow. Carolyn Resnick, our other member, is having knee surgery, so we have excused her, and we wish her the best. So 24 years ago puts us at 2001, and of course 9/11, which we just celebrated, or I wouldn't say celebrated, observed. In foreign policy, also that year began the war on terror, U.S. going to Afghanistan, as well as at home, the passing of the Patriot Act and the Office of Homeland Security. And also in that year were the dot-com bust, the collapse of Enron, the draft of genome sequencing, and China joining the World Trade Organization. So bringing us forward to today, we can now see the impact of China becoming a member of the WTO. And now that has spurred, among other things, China's dramatic rise as a world power. China of today is confident, aggressive, and a major challenge to the US, the world order, and on a regional basis, its neighbors in Southeast Asia. But before I turn you over to Amy Friedman, let me just remind you of our format. Our speaker will talk for about 35 minutes, and then we'll continue with questions, first from our panelists, and then also with our viewers, who please enter into the chat, and we will give you questions, and we will read your questions to our speaker if the subject area hasn't been covered. We have a hard stop at 11:15. Um, as you know, our program is being recorded so that they are archived and on-demand viewing at the Chappaqua Library website under Events and Foreign Policy. And now I am delighted to turn you over to Amy Friedman, who in her own right is an expert in Southeast Asia and is chair of the government department at Pace University. And Amy, will you introduce us to our speaker today? And we are very excited to have him with us.
Yeah, great. Thank you, June. And good to see everybody virtually. It's great to kick off our next year of foreign policy discussions. I'm delighted that Greg Poling was able to join us today. I've followed Greg's work for years. He is prolific in his writing, organizing conferences, hosting podcasts. So all things Southeast Asia related. Greg is one of my go-to people. He is the director of the Southeast Asia Program and the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where he is also a senior fellow. He's a leading expert, and I think we'll hear more, I hope today, on the South China Sea disputes, and conducts research on US alliances and partnerships. He's interested in questions about democratization and governance in Southeast Asia, and of course, larger questions about maritime security across the Indo-Pacific. I was interested over the summer to read, Greg, your testimony to Congress about the China's gray zone behavior in the South China Seas, and there's some really interesting developments where countries in the region have, I guess I would say, sort of learned to navigate and proceed despite Chinese harassment and aggression. So I'll be interested to hear your take on that. Greg is the author, like I said, of many reports, and his work on Dangerous Ground, America's Century in the South China Sea, again, also with various works on US relations with Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, and Southeast Asia as a whole. You can find his writings in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, the Wall Street Journal, and the Naval War College Review, among others. Mr. Pauling received his master's in international affairs from American University and holds a BA in history and philosophy from St. Mary's College of Maryland. So join me in welcoming Greg, and we're going to turn it over to you. And Greg, we're going to kind of go dark so that the focus is on you, but we will reappear once you're done speaking and have the Q&A.
Well, thank you, Amy. That's very, very kind. And thank you for Chappaqua Library for hosting. I'll apologize in advance if my voice goes at some point. As I was telling the members, I just got back Friday from a 8-day trip to Manila and brought a nasty cold home with me. So this is my first day off the couch since I got home. I think that the title that was shared for this session was Southeast Asia's response to the second Trump administration. So I'll keep my opening remarks at that very high level, and then happy to dive in and talk about details, including current developments in the South China Sea. We've also got a lot of domestic developments around the region that I'm happy to touch on. Before getting on here, I just finished recording the next episode of our podcast on the state of the civil war in Burma or Myanmar, and have an article coming out today on the new government in Thailand that was set up last week. But let's keep the focus on the U.S. And the reason to start this off that we need to be focused on Southeast Asia is that we really are now entering a probably 20-year period or so in which Southeast Asia is in many ways going to be determinative of the direction of the global economy and of global rules and norms and institutions. I mean, this is a region of nearly 700 million people. It accounts for now a significant and growing percentage of overall global economic growth. The region is growing faster than China economically, and GDP growth in Southeast Asia is going to continue to outstrip that of China by larger and larger margins for at least the next 2 decades. The region is also growing demographically, which China is not. So if we look at what does the new phase of global growth look like, the kind of post-China driven phase of global growth, in which the US and China remain maybe 20%-ish each of global GDP, who is now driving that engine? It's going to be Southeast Asia and maybe to a degree India. And so we can't simply write off the region as an appendage of overall U.S. Indo-Pacific policy. And that makes it critical to understand how the region is thinking about U.S. global leadership and to what degree regional states will or will not support U.S. efforts to lead globally. And the disruptions of the Trump administration now, the second Trump administration, are therefore particularly important and particularly worrying. There's not a single government in Southeast Asia that did not expect change from the second Trump administration. They all understood that a new Trump administration would want to address global trade imbalances as the administration sees it, that the administration would seek to significantly change and or cut U.S. foreign assistance programs, that the administration would be far less interested in supporting international rules and order. But I think universally, the countries of Southeast Asia have been shocked by the uh, amplitude of the shift that they've seen. That not just an administration that is questioning international rules and norms, but an administration that seems overtly hostile to them. And for Southeast Asia, that's really worrying because Southeast Asian states almost universally are huge proponents of the international rules-based order. The post-World War II system has been very good to Southeast Asia. It provided the regional stability that allowed the first group of Asian tigers and then the second group of Asian tiger economies to grow out of some of the least developed nations on Earth to now upper middle income countries that are driving global growth. And they have very little interest in seeing the international system revert to a might makes right, law of the jungle or spheres of influence system, which is where they worry that the U.S. is going. One of the words that I hear with increasing frequency around the region, behind closed doors, from regional elites, government, business, and academic, is betrayal. That they feel like they invested decades in building relationships and supporting a U.S. forward presence in the Indo-Pacific, and that they played ball with the first Trump administration and made clear they would play ball with the second, and yet they were singled out for particularly rough treatment so far under the second Trump administration. I will note that there is one exception to this, which I'll get to, and that's the Philippines. The Philippines has largely been treated better than not just other Southeast Asian countries, but better than almost any other country on earth under the second Trump administration. But for the rest of the region, I mean, this is a region driven largely by export-oriented emerging markets. And if you look at the tariffs that were announced by the administration on Liberation Day back in April, the so-called reciprocal tariffs, other than Lesotho, which was given the highest rate in the world, 50%, the next four were Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam, all between 46 and 49% placed on them. And then I believe Thailand had 36, Indonesia had 32. And then better off in relative terms were Malaysia and Brunei at 24, Philippines at 17, and Singapore, which is the only country in the region that runs a deficit with the US, not the other way around, they were given 10%. That was utterly stunning, particularly to Vietnam and Cambodia, but really to all the countries. I mean, these are economies who um, depend on the US market in a way that is hard to appreciate sometimes. 40% of Cambodian exports go to the US. 20-ish percent of Vietnamese exports go to the US. And the reason that that percentage has gotten so high is because of US policy. The US, starting with the first Trump administration and continuing under Biden, pushed countries and companies to pursue what we call the China Plus One strategy, to divert manufacturing investment away from China to other markets. So one of the reasons that Vietnam's trade surplus with the US, for instance, exploded over the last 5 years is because of US policy. So there's a real sense in Hanoi that we encouraged this to happen. Vietnam did what we wanted by encouraging investment to divert away from China to Vietnam. And now Vietnam is going to be punished for it in a way that could really cripple the economy. I mean, this is borderline existential for them. Now, what's ended up happening over the last few months is a series of negotiations, and the Vietnamese were the first in the region to jump on those negotiations. They were the second in the world after the Brits to announce a provisional deal with the US. And they managed to get their tariff rate down to 20%. Pretty much everybody else in the region at this point has now landed at either 19 or 20%. Brunei is still at 25. The only exceptions are Laos and Myanmar, which export vanishingly little to the US. So everybody has now come down to this band. The developed economies of Asia, Korea, Japan, etc., are around 15. Southeast Asia and Taiwan are between 19 and 20. And so nobody's competitive advantage is really being hurt. The American consumer will just eat that difference. But the initial shock is going to take much longer to go away. And the sense that it was capricious, that there was nothing they could do about it, that the reciprocal tariffs weren't really based on anything other than a crude mathematical equation, that has really shaken confidence in the system, or confidence in the U.S. On top of that, you had the freeze in U.S. foreign assistance declared in January as soon as the administration came in. This also hit the region particularly hard. The best example of this is probably the Thai-Burma border, where you've had refugee communities who have been living for decades because of the ongoing series of civil wars in Myanmar. And the problem was not necessarily that the US chose to wind down USAID contracts in the region. That would have been expected. That could have been mitigated. The problem was that the US canceled those overnight. It chose not to fulfill contracts already signed. It chose not to wait out the fiscal year to give people chances to adapt. And so you literally had hospitals shut down overnight, people thrown off ventilators to die in the streets of Thai border communities, when the major earthquake hit outside of Mandalay in Myanmar earlier this year. You had these ridiculous scenes of Chinese and Russian personnel helping clear rubble and pull survivors out. And the US government spent a month just trying to figure out how to get a small amount of money in because the US belatedly said, okay, we'll send in a few $1 million. I think the initial announcement was like 3 million. And the embassy in Bangkok said, well, we don't have anybody left. We fired all the US aid contractors. We don't have anybody to send it in. And it was this, on and on cycle. So the cruelty of it, which seemed almost intentional, was another shock to the system for the region. And then on top of all of that, there is the concern, the anxiety from partners like Singapore, or to a degree the Philippines, also Indonesia, Malaysia, you know, countries who are not U.S. allies, but have significant military relationships with the U.S. and have provided a lot of support over the years to ensure that the U.S. remains a forward deployed military force in the Indo-Pacific in order to balance against China and provide regional stability. They have a deep anxiety about whether or not the U.S. actually will remain engaged as a regional security provider, a stability provider. They look at the way the U.S. has treated NATO and Japan and Korea, the ambiguity about the U.S. stance on Taiwan, and regardless of the value they place on any one of those commitments, what they see is a U.S. that doesn't seem committed to much of anything, a U.S. that is pursuing foreign policy effectively in the same way that China or Russia does, and that therefore will not be able to be counted on any more than China or Russia will. It's an America that seems to pursue its own naked self-interest, divorced largely from any values-based, underpinnings, which is very different. I mean, the one thing, as much as countries in the region might have griped about U.S. values-based diplomacy and the heavy-handedness of it, it was predictable. They knew where the U.S. was going to stand on certain issues. Now they have no idea where the U.S. is going to stand on any given issue. And that is deeply unsettling, given how much they've relied on the U.S. to provide a counterweight, particularly to a China that they know is revisionist and seeks a hegemony that would be bad for their national interests. The responses of the region have been diverse, as you would expect, based on their own calculation of their national interest, based on how open and vulnerable they are to potential U.S. retaliation. But the one thing that is becoming clear is that they've all had basically the same economic response. You've had a short-term focus on trying to secure a trade deal with the administration as quickly as possible in order to minimize the damage from the global trade disruptions caused by the tariffs. And as I said, that led everybody to rush in and secure a deal somewhere between 19 and 20%. Although there's a ton of uncertainty still, the only paperwork we have from any of the Southeast Asian deals is a joint statement from the U.S. Indonesia deal. And it is very light on detail. So nobody actually knows what the final rate for any of these countries will be. All of them assume that they will just have to negotiate it day in and day out for the rest of the administration, that there is no such thing as a deal with this administration that won't be eventually reopened and renegotiated. But in the long term, what you're seeing is the beginning of a really consequential shift toward diversification of trade. Nobody is turning away from the US market. It's too big to ignore, just like nobody has entirely turned away from the China market. But in the same way that they pursued a China plus one strategy under pressure from the US administration the last time around, they are now pursuing in many ways a US plus one strategy. They will continue to sell to the US market at whatever exorbitant price Americans are forced to pay by the American government, and they will continue to sell to the Chinese market. But they will have a separate and far more efficient supply chain directed at selling to the rest of the world. And in order to ensure that they have anchor economies to support that supply chain, they're looking primarily to the Europeans and the Gulf. Earlier this year, you had the second meeting of the Gulf Cooperation Council and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN. You also had the first ASEAN Gulf Cooperation Council China meeting. And one of the outcomes of that was a GCC ASEAN agreement to pursue a free trade agreement. You've had a series of bilateral agreements. The Indonesians plan to ink a free trade agreement with the European Union later this year. The Philippines has restarted negotiations. They just had their third round with the European Union. I believe the Malaysians signed an agreement with the Europeans. You also have individual agreements with the UK. Indonesia and Malaysia are both close to a free trade agreement with the Gulf Cooperation Council. And pretty much everybody who hasn't already signed one is looking at an FTA with the Gulf Cooperation Council. And then the really big one is you have all the countries in the region who aren't already members of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This is the now 12-member FTA that was negotiated under the Obama administration and the US abandoned, but it did come into force under Japanese leadership. All the members not already part of that are seeking to go in. So the Philippines, Thailand, and Indonesia, the last big economies in Southeast Asia that aren't in it, are planning to apply for membership. The South Koreans have also said they're finally going to apply for membership. The UK was the most recent to join that. So those alone, you will have basically all the big economies of Asia: Japan, Korea, all the biggest Southeast Asian economies, Australia, New Zealand, but not China and not Taiwan, along with Canada, Mexico, the UK, and several Southeast Asian or South American economies. That's already the most important trading bloc on Earth. And then, in addition to that, you have the European Union for the first time expressing interest in joining CPTPP, as it's called. And Ursula von der Leyen has, the EU commissioner, has specifically said that the European Union is looking at how to cooperate with TPP, whether that's joining the agreement or signing a series of bilateral FTAs to make the EU a de facto member of TPP. And should that happen, then you have a European Indo-Pacific trading bloc large enough to effectively serve as the new rules of the international trading system. In a post WTO world, doesn't matter what the Americans think, doesn't matter what the Chinese think, that body has the weight to maintain the rules and maintain stability. And that's the long-term play, right? Now, I think what you're going to see, this is the most obvious example and the one that's fully formed, but you're going to see efforts like this across the board on normative issues, on security issues. US partners and allies not turning away from the US. The US is too big to be abandoned or ignored, but desperately seeking diversification with each other in order to provide a third alternative. That in a world in which the US is just as unpredictable and in some cases just as rapacious as China and Russia, the only hope is to seek coordination among themselves. And that alliance of middle powers has to involve the Europeans, the Gulf, and ASEAN, the South Asian countries. Those are the parties, along potentially with the Indians, that have the weight in the system to do it. And in the best case scenario, the option then is to build something that you can wait out the Trump administration and then hold the door open for American participation. Worst case scenario, it's something that can provide a long-term alternative to the United States if the US proves to be isolationist in the long term. Now, let me close with the one big exception to this, which I noted, and that's the Philippines. The Philippines is the oldest U.S. treaty ally in the Indo-Pacific. Their mutual defense treaty is older than the one we have with Australia or Japan or Korea. And the Philippines has been uniquely well treated by the Trump administration. It is the only U.S. treaty ally in the world right now that has received zero public pressure to increase defense spending and zero public pressure to clarify its stance on things like a Taiwan contingency, what it would do if China were to invade Taiwan. And so it hasn't faced any of the politically difficult questions that Japan and Korea and NATO have so far under the administration. It's also been the focus of all of the first meetings for senior U.S. leadership. Secretary of Defense, sorry, now Secretary of War, Hegseth's first trip to Asia was to Manila. Secretary Rubio's first meeting with Southeast Asian counterpart was with his Philippine counterpart, who I think he's now met 4 times. Well, either spoken with over the phone or met physically 4 times. Last month, President Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr. got the first Oval Office meeting of any Southeast Asian leader when he came to Washington. And in that meeting, he received the most positive, almost uncomfortable amount of praise from President Trump that I've seen any foreign leader receive. At one point, President Trump started asking all the reporters in the room who were Filipino where they're from. When they said the Philippines, he said, "Oh, you're so lucky to be from the Philippines. It's a great place. Make the Philippines great again." I've never heard Donald Trump say a nice thing about any country that wasn't the United States. So there seems to be a genuine warmth and bonhomie that he has toward the Philippines. This has resulted in some real benefits for the Philippines. When every other country on earth had all of their foreign assistance frozen, the Philippines, alongside Taiwan and Ukraine, were the first 3 in February to have their foreign military financing unstuck. So the Philippines received almost $350 million in frozen foreign military financing funds within the first months of the administration. During President Marcos's trip to Washington last month, the Philippines received about $70 million in new grants from the State Department. That is the first new foreign assistance granted to any country under the Trump administration. We've also had U.S. officials publicly state on more than one occasion now that the Article 5, which is the mutual defense provision of the U.S. Philippines Treaty, applies to any attack by China on Filipinos in the South China Sea, which is the kind of uncritical commitment that the Europeans would love to hear from the Trump administration. And it goes on and on. I mean, there really does. Even, I mean, for instance, the biggest U.S. economic program in the Philippines right now is called the Luzon Economic Corridor. It's this massive trilateral U.S., Philippine, Japan effort to build infrastructure in the Philippines, which was part of the PGII, the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment under the Biden administration. Now, obviously, the Trump administration wants nothing to do with PGII or any other Biden administration legacy, but they have publicly said that they are supportive of the Luzon Economic Corridor and have announced new funding for it. So the Philippines, so far at least, is probably the one country on earth that, while nervous about Trump, has so far not seen any major repercussions other than the inevitable effects of the global trade war and the global uh, shifts in U.S. funding priorities, but nothing specific to the Philippines, right? No stick directed at Manila. I don't know that that will last, but it is telling, and it suggests that the U.S. Philippine alliance may be able to ride the administration out easier than not only the rest of South Asia, but easier than our Northeast Asian allies or our European allies, who I think, because of their higher development status or higher income, fall more easily into the trope of free riders. It's very hard for the Trump administration to paint the Philippines, a developing country standing up to China, as a free rider. And so in many ways it falls outside of the intellectual boxes that the Trump administration uses to name and shame other allies. And my voice is starting to go. As I said, I have a cold. So why don't I conclude my opening remarks there, and I welcome any questions. Thank you.
Great, Greg, that was terrific. That was really a sweeping set of ideas and update about the region to get us started. If I could, June, with your okay, can I take the lead and asking some questions, and then June, I don't know if you want me to kind of traffic other questions or whether you want to step into that role. So Greg, I kind of have, maybe it's a 2-part question or comment that I would love your reaction to. Joseph Liao, who joined our group last year, had a piece in Foreign Affairs, maybe in the late spring, where he essentially said that Southeast Asia was no longer sort of playing off the US and China, that really, with the exception of the Philippines, really Southeast Asia has just fallen into China's orbit. That's a broad summary. And I wonder if what you think of that proposition, and then kind of the second piece of it, which I'm trying to reconcile, is the behavior we're seeing in the South China Seas, where countries in the South China Seas have pushed back more robustly against China and gone ahead with oil and gas exploration. And so I wonder how to kind of square these two different phenomenon. One, that countries in Southeast Asia are friendlier to China, and two, they are also figuring out ways of maybe protecting and asserting their own sovereignty.
So well, had this debate with Joseph on the sidelines of the event at Columbia early this year, last time we saw each other, and I still disagree with Joseph. Uh, so there is no perfect way to quantify influence, right? And Southeast Asia is a remarkably diverse place. That's trite to say, but it's true. So any attempt to like say the Southeast Asian opinion is always going to be imperfect. Um, if so, one thing that we collect in my team and we publish reports on every year is we look at the Gallup public opinion surveys, which are collected in every country in Southeast Asia, except for Brunei, in local language, nationally representative samples going back to 2008. If you use those, the US remains more popular than China on net across the region and in most of the biggest countries of the region. And in fact, opinions about Chinese leadership in the world today are considerably lower than they were even in Obama 1. I mean, there's a downturn, as you see around the world. When Republicans are elected, the US is less popular in the world. I hope that's not shocking to anybody. That's a universal trait almost everywhere in the world, with the exception of Israel, basically. But when you balance that all out over time, even during the first Trump administration, at the kind of bottom of the curve, we were far more popular everywhere in South Asia than we were during the Bush administration. And more importantly, China is far more unpopular. China's behavior over the last 15 years across the region has undermined trust in China's leadership. So even when the US is at its low points, the best you get is a pox on both your houses response from Southeast Asia. Nobody looks to the US and says, you're being a jerk, and therefore I like that other jerk up there. They just say, great, now I'm surrounded by two jerks, and I have to try to manage this. One other way to look at this is you can look at elite opinion surveys, which is what Joseph and a lot of others do. And in that, they only look at one survey, which is the IISS South Asia survey, which we've done a lot of work on and talked about the methodology before. It's really good for Singapore and Malaysia and really bad for everywhere else in the region. They talk to like 80 people in the Philippines, a country of 112 million people, and they say, here's what Filipinos think. And they talk to 80 people in Vietnam, which has 102 million people, and they say, here's what Vietnam thinks. And it's the same 100 people every year because it's the 100 people that happen to be on their mailing list. One model we've come up with this year to try to that we'll be publishing soon, at least our initial cut. This is going to be a kind of a long-term project for us, is try to come up with a combination of public opinion and government behavior as an overall index for relative US and China influence. And to do that, acknowledging that all indicators are imperfect, we use overall public opinion. So the questions that Gallup asked about how do you feel about U.S. global leadership? How do you feel about China's global leadership? We also include Russia. And then their overall alignment with the US or China on important UN votes. And those are the UN votes that the US State Department defines as important and on which the US lobbies. And you combine those together, and it gives us a overall index for influence, the influence that the US and China have on both publics and governments across the region. Now, you can argue that that's not accurate in capturing the absolute, because maybe one of those indicators should matter more or less. But it gives you a direction of change. And I can tell you that in 2024, the most recent numbers we have, the US is at a -2%, which means that overall this goes from the scale is basically +20 to -20. We're at -2. So basically within the margin of error. It's the same place we were in 2021. It's the same place we were in 2015. Overall, the US continues to see a modest increase across the region on net. If you were to draw this out, the whole period we have from 2008 to 2024. Now, um, all of that said, I expect the 2025 numbers to look a lot worse. And so it is entirely possible that we are at a watershed moment here. Again, I think the thing that makes it really hard to imagine any of these indexes, whichever one you want to use, us, the Lowy index, the IISS index, I don't care. They're all going to move around a pretty narrow point. And that's because China is deeply unpopular. And no matter how badly the US behaves, it does not result in China behaving any better toward its regional neighbors. So you can diminish US standing in the world, but that does not mean that you are improving China's. As for the, and I look, I will note, I testified for House Foreign Affairs Committee earlier this year, and this was back in May, I think. So, still relatively early in the administration. And I said, shutting down VOA and RFA, canceling Fulbright, ending the new student visa interviews, and the way that we ended U.S. aid, all of these things are doing generational damage to U.S. soft power in the region. And I still believe that. There is no quickly coming back from this. But I still maintain it doesn't mean that China's any softer and cuddlier in the eyes of its neighbors than it was at the beginning of the year. It just means that we're just as bad, or maybe almost as bad. On the South China Sea, yeah, it's an interesting story and one that our team at the Asian Maritime Transparency Initiative has been telling for a few years. We've been using commercial satellite imagery and vessel tracking and other open source intelligence tools to track developments in the South China Sea for more than a decade now. And every single year we put out reports that showed quantitative metrics by which China was in greater control of the South China Sea with every passing year. And that ended in the end of 2021. We have not put out a single report for 4 years that shows China in greater control of the South China Sea than it was at the end of 2021. Now, partially that's because China had gained so much. There wasn't a whole lot left, right? And so the last nuts were the hardest to crack. But it's also because that's where the Southeast Asians have chosen to stand up. If you look at the oil and gas front, Malaysia has broken records for new oil and gas wells drilled within China's claimed waters. Vietnam and Indonesia have both drilled new oil and gas wells in the face of months-long Chinese Coast Guard deployments to try to stop them. The Philippines spent more than a year running Chinese blockades of at times 60 or 70 vessels in order to repair and resupply the BRP Sierra Madre. It's this old US LST on Second Thomas Shoal. The Philippines is still patrolling Scarborough Shoal despite persistent Chinese patrols. Some of you might have seen the video last month of China Navy frigates swiping the bow of a China Coast Guard vessel trying to stop a Filipino patrol, which, by the way, left at least 3 and probably 4 Chinese mariners dead, but we're never going to hear about that in public because China won't admit it. But, unless they can fly, you can look at the videos and see where they were standing and then where that part of the superstructure disappeared. In all of these cases, the argument we make is that Southeast Asian governments have found that they actually can stand up to what's sometimes called gray zone pressure. This Chinese desire to use Coast Guard and militia violence short of the level of military force in order to intimidate and bully its neighbors. And the reason it works is because the Southeast Asian governments have realized that China does not want to escalate to military force, at least not for now. And as long as China doesn't want to use military force, there's actually not very much China can do to stop them, right? China has a blockade around Second Thomas Shoal. If the Filipinos are committed to just dead rudder right through that and dare the Chinese to open fire, and the Chinese don't open fire, what you get is every single Philippine resupply mission gets through. They get through with a lot of dents and dings. They get through with some injuries, but they get through. And it puts the burden of escalation on the Chinese side. And so far, that's working. And I like to think that I'm not completely crazy because the head of Pac Fleet, Admiral Kaler, made this exact same argument using a lot of the exact same anecdotes that I use when he spoke both at the Arbitral Tribunal anniversary in Manila in July and when he spoke at our conference at CSIS, our annual South Tennessee conference in June. So I'm not sure that there's a lot of people that agree with me, but I think Pac Fleet does.
Um, sure. Why don't we just kind of go through the panel here? June, do you want to start?
Yeah. So, Greg, would you say, I think certainly when we hear this and the changes, it's, we have to question what our government is doing. But is a side effect of this, in fact, sort of allowing maybe if the goal of the United States is sort of to not make itself responsible for protecting the world, that in fact pulling back or whatever it is we're doing, forcing them to make alliances with other centers of, the Middle East, Europe, um, that also they would then also not only diversify their exports and connections, but also they would also be more interested in defending the Southeast Asian area rather than just looking to the U.S.
Well, yes, but the argument's much easier to make in the context of Europe, right? I mean, the European Union, in theory, has 450 million people and a GDP nearly as big as the United States, standing up to Russia with something like 1/12 of Europe's GDP. It's you know, often cast as a gas station with nuclear weapons. There's no reason that Europe could not, in theory, deter Russia on its own. Now, it needs time, largely because we spent the last 50 years explicitly blocking Europe from developing an indigenous defense capability and then pretended that that was Europe's choice. We did not want Europe capable of defending itself because then we wouldn't have a veto on European decisions. So, yes, I think it is, you could argue, um, and I do think in the long term it is good that the Europeans carry more of the water, not just for their own defense, but also normatively in the world, right? The Europeans claim to be a normative superpower, meaning that they get to set rules and standards, and they've done a very good job of doing that, but they've done it completely divorced from the responsibilities of global leadership. They haven't had to make hard choices for decades. Now they do. And that is good. That is also going to be extremely frustrating to the United States. We have this very narrow idea that it's just going to save us money. What it's also going to do is mean that we're going to lose a lot more arguments in international fora than we're used to. Um, but when we look at Asia, Northeast Asia, I mean, combine Japan and South Korea and Taiwan, and you've still got fewer than 200 million people standing up against a country of 1.4 billion. You can add in Southeast Asia if you want. They're not going to act as a bloc, but let's say you do. And India. You combine them all together, and yeah, you get more people than China has, but with very little shared purpose. The Europeans, if they are committed to the defense of Europe, cannot possibly help defend Asia in any meaningful way. In fact, even the little bit of security work that Europe is doing, like the Brits sending another carrier through the Taiwan Strait, the U.S. opposes. Deputy Secretary of Defense Bridge Colby told the Europeans to keep their ships in Europe and stop playing in Asia. So apparently, we don't want European help in the Indo Pacific. Not that they could provide a substantial amount of help. So Europe can, in theory, carry its own water in Europe. There is no world in which Asia defends itself from China without US support. So you cannot, there is no argument that says we pull back to our side of the Pacific that doesn't end with, and therefore China gets to be a hegemon in Asia. So, I mean, we have to be honest about the choice we're making. If we say that we want Taiwan to fall, and we want the South China Sea to fall, and therefore we want the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea to no longer exist, freedom of navigation no longer exist, betray one of the oldest national interests we've had, that Jefferson championed, the reason we sent the Marines against the Barbary States, fine. make that argument. We can say that we prefer a world of spheres of influence and the end of the idea of a global maritime order and global commons. But we should be honest about the choice we're making in that circumstance. On the economic side, I'd also say yes, there is, if we squint hard enough, there is a long term version of this that doesn't look cataclysmic, in which the Europeans and the Gulf and ASEAN, and maybe the Indians, but you can tell I'm more skeptical there, are able to spackle together a mini lateral economic block, a normative block that can uphold the key components of what used to be contained in the GATT and the WTO and help carry it forward into the 21st century on things like AI and digital. And the best scenario is, again, that holds open a door that a future US administration can walk through and say, okay, we want to, thanks, we got our stuff together. Now we would like to help set these rules and norms. Or if we don't want to do that, we just want to take our ball and go home, fine. Then we can have our own little closed autarkic system here, and China can have its little closed autarkic system there, and everybody else will trade around us. And companies will maintain three supply chains, two that are wildly inefficient and overpriced for the American and Chinese market, and everybody else will enjoy the bounty of, better regulated globalization. That's not necessarily the way it's going to go, but that is what all the middle powers are after.
Tyler, do you want to go next?
Sure, thank you. Greg, you spent quite a bit of time earlier talking about the cozier relationship or the strangely cozy relationship with which the U.S. And Trump have decided to treat the Philippines. My question is, why do you think that's happening? Is it because we realize that the bases we already have, and I referred to this earlier, in the Philippines, the fact that we've already have a military presence there and their willingness over the last year or so to give us access to bases in the northern islands off the north coast of the Philippines. Is that the reason, or are there more fundamental kind of uh, I don't know, reasons from history and culture and so forth that we might be treating them in a more affable, positive way?
Well, we have to distinguish the we from the he, right? I mean, the
Yeah.
reason that we, the U.S. like body politic and the Washington blob views the Philippines so positively has been a kind of a 10-year transition to recognizing both the strategic value of the Philippines, starting with the South China Sea and now including Taiwan. And so there's been an awakening on Capitol Hill, in August. I just got back from Manila. In August, there were 8 congressional delegations to the Philippines. I think
Mm.
3 Senate and 5 staff delegations, which is insane. I mean, but everybody wants to learn about the Philippines and go. I mean, it's still very much secondary or tertiary to the Japanese, but a growing part there. It also helps that there's an enormous amount of people to people exchange. There are 4.5 million Filipinos or Filipino Americans in the United States. Tagalog is the fourth most spoken language in the US after English, Spanish, and Chinese. You know, there it's there's a shared cultural lexicon that doesn't exist with anywhere else in Asia, even with Japan, which is what happens when you colonize a place for 50 years, which is something that we don't talk about because we don't write it into our history books. But for the Philippines, it's omnipresent. Um, but all of that aside, why does Trump care, right? Because that explains why, like, a Bridge Colby might care, why Marco Rubio likes the Philippines. It has nothing to do with why Donald Trump likes the Philippines, because it's not at all clear that Donald Trump intends to defend Taiwan, or cares one way or another. And this is a little less clear. I mean, we know a few things. One, Donald Trump does seem to like the Marcos family. He has, I think, as he does with many things, he is trapped in the mid 80s. And so he views Ferdinand Marcos and Imelda as, you know, strongman, Reagan's buddies. He also did a business deal, sold or bought real estate from Imelda in the early 90s.
Ah,
So, as with many things, he has a, I don't know, it
yeah.
reminds him of his better days or what he imagines as the United States better days.
Well, he loves autocrats, So,
He
And
does
food.
love autocrats, but I mean, if there's anybody on earth who had roughly the same taste as Donald Trump, it was Imelda Marcos, right? I mean,
yeah, right.
the only person who might have more gilded crap in their house. But that
400,
aside,
400 pairs of shoes, right?
that's right.
Well, that's not crap. Speaking of a woman.
But but I think it also helps that Trump won the Philippine American vote, but by a very, very narrow margin. But he lost the Asian American vote, but the two sub constituencies he won were the Philippine American and the Vietnamese American vote.
Uh,
And the Vietnamese embassy or the Philippine embassy, I think, is very good at reminding him of that.
uh-huh.
Um, I think it also helps, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, that the Philippines is a developing country standing up to China. So when you think of the caricature that Trump and those around him have of U.S. allies, most of them it's a caricature of wealthy industrialized countries sitting back waiting for the U.S. to defend them. But the Philippines can't fit into that caricature. So instead, they get a positive kind of David versus Goliath character, which is still a caricature, but one that works to their advantage. So
Yeah,
I think all of that combines to give Trump a kind of a genuine positive sense toward Filipinos and the Philippines. He also, I don't know how much this factors in, but he's got this weird thing with William McKinley. Like he's read
yeah,
just enough to think that McKinley's his favorite president. And
right.
so I suspect that he is just vaguely aware of the fact that McKinley is the one that annexed the Philippines.
Uh-huh. Yeah, yeah,
But
Look
I,
at
I,
the
I
look
really,
on Amy's face. It's like,
yeah, I hesitate to go too deep psychoanalyzing our president. But it is, as with many things, it comes down to weird idiosyncratic explanations.
yeah. Just to quickly extend the question a little bit, those islands that they've been granted access to, that we have been granted access to the north, do they significantly improve our tactical advantage vis-a-vis an eventual possible invasion of Taiwan? Are they that meaningful?
Yes and no. So look, this is one that's highly contested, and in which I'm maybe often on the minority side of these arguments. But I think that the overwhelming majority of these arguments come from China hands in Indo-PACOM,
Hmm.
um, and very rarely do they ask those of us who actually work on the Philippines. So for background, right, we do not have American bases in the Philippines. In 2014, under the Obama administration, we signed what's called the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, or EDCA. EDCA gives the U.S. certain access rights in agreed upon Philippine bases with the permission of the Philippines. So it does not look anything like U.S. basing in Japan or Korea. It's actually modeled on what we've done with the Marines in Darwin in Northern Australia, where we have a very, very small number of Americans that are allowed in to a Philippine base under Philippine command. And they can build things that'll be used by both sides. They can pre-position equipment, etc. They can use it for joint exercises. The original 5 EDCA sites were spread all across the country, but the most important ones were air bases in Luzon and Palawan focused on the South China Sea. That was expanded as part of this. There's been this huge amount of effort in the U.S. Philippine alliance over the last 4 years, going back to the start of the Biden administration, to upgrade the alliance. And part of that was expanding EDCA to include 4 more bases. Of those, another one is on Palawan, clearly targeting the South China Sea. One is in kind of north central Luzon that can be used for anything. And then 2 of them are on the northern coast of Luzon, looking at Taiwan. So, we should keep this in context. Only 2 of the 9 sites have any potential use in a Taiwan contingency. And they're not the 2 that have been most developed. Most of the money and most of the U.S. access is in the ones on the South China Sea. But there is a lot of interest in what could you hypothetically do with the 2 in the north. And the Philippines is also interested in this because they are aware that there's more and more Chinese activity in their northern approaches. And President Marcos has said repeatedly that if China were to invade Taiwan, it would directly impact Philippine interests. One, it's only 200 kilometers from Luzon to Taiwan. And if you talk about the northernmost of the Philippine Islands in Batanes, it's actually like 40 miles from the
Yeah,
northernmost of the Philippine Islands to the
that's
southernmost
what I
of
was
Indonesia.
thinking of. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I mean Yami and Orchid are both very, very tiny, but I mean you can basically see from one to the other on a particularly clear day. Two, there are roughly 200,000 Filipino overseas workers living in Taiwan. In
Mm,
fact, overall, 5% of the population of Taiwan are Southeast Asian workers from Philippines, Vietnam, and Indonesia. So
mm,
there's no world in which China uses military force against Taiwan that thousands of Southeast Asians are not killed, with huge implications for domestic politics in those countries. And
mm.
three, the Philippines is a U.S. treaty ally, and the Mutual Defense Treaty is mutual. Article 4 and 5 goes both ways. If Americans are fighting and dying anywhere in the Pacific, the Philippines is obligated to lend aid, just like
Yeah.
the US is if Filipinos are fighting and dying. So all of that has the Philippines thinking very hard about what they could do. This is a roundabout way to get to your question. How much would they actually matter? The the consensus is they would be nice to have, but we have to be realistic. Everything in northern Luzon is within range of Chinese missiles on the
Mm,
mainland. At best, you would be able to get, I don't know, a squadron, maybe two, out of one of the Philippine air bases for a run over Taiwan before they're cratered.
mm.
Marginal impact on the overall operation. At best, a Marine Littoral Regiment, one of the MLRs. So we've got these are the new Marine flexible units that are focused on long range fires and ISR within the first island chain. You've got one of those in Okinawa. You've got one that's going to be rotating heel toe through the Philippines. What, they get off a couple of shots before they're also detected? Not that useful. And you're not going to be able to invest enough in those bases in the next few years to make that big a difference. So in every war game that I know of, in which the US actually has a hope of winning, which in a lot of them we don't, but in those where the US actually can successfully defend Taiwan from an amphibious invasion, what matters are US long range fires, so US long range bombers firing from out of missile range from Guam and
Mm,
subs. Philippines
mhm.
doesn't. Where the Philippines can be really useful, though, is what if you have those MLRs doing ISR and targeting but not firing, right? They can guide munitions in and they can provide ISR from the northern coast of the Philippines without actually being combatants. Or what if you use the Philippine bases to pre-position logistics, fuel porting, things like that, to serve as rear position, but not a combatant, while Japan and Guam are the places you actually fight from. And third, they will be critical for non-combatant evacuation operations. There are tens of
Mm.
thousands of Americans and Europeans and Japanese in Taiwan, and as I said, roughly a million or more Southeast Asians in Taiwan. If
Yeah.
you want to get them out, this is
Mhm.
not going to look like the huge lines of vehicles fleeing Kiev in 2022 for Poland and Germany. The
Mm.
only places you can go are the mainland of China, which no one's going to pick, Yonaguni in Japan, which will have very limited capability and will be a combatant,
Uh-huh.
or the northern Luzon. So there are ways that the Philippines can be really, really valuable, but I don't think it is by missiles or combat aircraft taking off from Luzon. I actually think if we do that, we are being very short-sighted, right? We are turning the Philippines into a combatant rather than having them serve the role of, say, a Poland that Poland has served in Ukraine as like the critical staging ground for support going in and people coming out.
Yeah. Very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. Naomi, you've been very patient.
Okay, I'm gonna throw a wild card in. So what do you think about North Korea in all this?
So
And
I
the defensive postures of everybody else in Southeast Asia and the mentality of Kim Jong-un.
so I will preface this with one. North Korea is the one thing in Asia that I basically don't cover in depth because there are way too many Korea experts in Washington, right? I mean, since the first Bush administration, there have been people whose entire careers have been focused on North Korea. Uh, but I will say, when it comes to Southeast Asia, there is shockingly little interest. I mean, the US government spends, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of dollars a year on grants to organize workshops and training on non-proliferation and focuses on WMD training, and Southeast Asian governments take it begrudgingly at best. They view North Korea as a tertiary concern, at best. They worry about South China Sea, they worry about Taiwan, they worry about, to a degree, the East China Sea because the Japanese are so present in Southeast Asia. They do not worry about a crisis on the peninsula. The South Koreans obviously do, and it has a lot of implications for how South Korea thinks about its own role, both in a Taiwan contingency and South Korea's effort to make itself a more normal regional security provider. Because, particularly under the previous administration, the Yoon government, you did see South Korea trying to step out and play a role as a global middle power instead of navel gazing at the peninsula as it has been for the last 80 years. That's reversing a bit now under the Lee administration, but there is growing concern among the allies, U.S., Japan, Korea, and to a much lesser degree the Philippines, about closer North Korea-Russia relations. There's concern about what kind of technology transfer the Koreans have received from Russia in exchange for the 10,000 troops that the Koreans sent to the front in Russia. There's always concern on the Korean side about whether or not the North Koreans would use a Taiwan contingency as an excuse to launch operations on the Korean Peninsula, or vice versa. If there was a crisis on the peninsula, would China use that as an excuse to launch operations in Taiwan? In my experience, the South Korean answer is almost always yes, and the American and Japanese answer is almost always probably not. But nobody agrees. And then there's always the question, which is somewhat, in my mind, distracting, of whether or not the U.S. would pull significant forces from U.S. Forces Korea in a Taiwan contingency. But that doesn't make a lot of sense because the overwhelming majority of USFK, U.S. Forces Korea, are Army units. And they're not going to be of any use in a Taiwan contingency, and you don't have any way of getting them from the peninsula to Taiwan anyway.
Well, that's the good news.
It's the best I have to offer.
And what about climate change in Southeast Asia? Islands being deluged with ocean water increasingly,
Hmm.
radical storms.
Yeah.
Does anybody care anymore?
Well, the Southeast Asian governments care.
Yeah.
You get these rankings that come out every year of which countries are most vulnerable to climate change, and they vary, but inevitably, at least four Southeast Asian countries always make the top 10 and often the top five, and that's Indonesia, the Philippines, Vietnam, and Thailand. Um, you know, Philippines gets hit by, on average, I think 20 severe storms a year. I mean, we just had massive flooding in Luzon last month because of two typhoons near simultaneously. Central Vietnam experienced nasty flooding last month because of a typhoon. Um, you have perpetual both flooding and haze from wildfires in Thailand. Uh, I think you have two concerns. One, you have increasingly violent storms that are only going to get worse and that, impose tens of billions of dollars of infrastructure damage and crop damage across the region every year that provides a pretty significant squeeze on government resources that these countries need. Two, you have a unique concern in Vietnam, which, if we're looking for a kind of a black swan crisis out to, say, the middle of the century, I would look to the Mekong Delta. Vietnam's Mekong Delta is the breadbasket for the country, one of the richest, most productive rice growing regions in the world. You have the combination of uh, increasing tidal inundation from rising sea levels, the steady subsidization of the land from tapping too much groundwater for irrigation, and the decreased water flow from the Mekong River because of China's damming upstream. All of those are combining to lose more and more of the delta every year to seawater inundation. And the Vietnamese are trying to take a page out of, say, the Netherlands book and build dikes and protect as much of it as they can, but there's only so much you can engineer away the problem. Pretty good chance that Vietnam loses something like a fifth of its territory to seawater inundation by the end of the century, and potentially provoking both a massive migration problem and a food security problem. But, you know, this led to things like the US and the Europeans putting to billions, tens of billions of dollars toward the JET-P programs, the Just Energy Transition programs, to encourage transitions to clean energy in Indonesia and Vietnam. The US has pulled support from those, naturally. Um, Indonesia, Vietnam, and the Philippines actually all increased their importation of coal last year and the year before because of skyrocketing LNG prices due to the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Mm.
For Southeast Asian governments, would they all like to transition to clean energy? Yes. Will that in any way fix the climate change problem? No, not if the rest of the world doesn't do it too. Um, and do their people want clean energy? Yes. Do they want it more than they want reliable electricity? No. So if the only option is coal or blackouts, they're going to take coal. And that is the choice that's been presented to them. The Biden administration, um, my team and others put out reports every year of the Biden administration that said your energy policies are going to increase net CO2 output in Southeast Asia. And that's exactly what happened. And they refused to accept it because their position was the US should not in any way fund the use of fossil fuels in Southeast Asia, which was a lovely idea, except there was no way in which you could have enough solar and wind uptake to account for new energy demand coming onto the grid in Southeast Asia, much less to replace legacy. And so your options were to fund the use of LNG in Southeast Asia, or they would use more coal. And that's exactly what happened. We let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
Mm.
Greg, do you have a few more minutes to take? Looks like Tyler has another question, but I'm keeping half an eye on the time. Are you okay for another 5 minutes?
Sure.
Okay, all right. Tyler, you're up.
Okay, thanks. What are your thoughts in general on the viability of the Quad alliance? We haven't heard much about it lately. That doesn't mean it's not solidified and functioning in terms of how these four countries get along together, but I just wonder if there are any thoughts going forward about that. And then AUKUS, where you have the question about is it viable to
Mhm.
buy those nuclear subs. It's going to be horrifically expensive, I guess. And I think there have been some doubts cast about whether that's a reasonable effort.
Yeah.
I know that's
So
a long
Quad,
question. Sorry. Yeah.
yeah, Quad. I mean, the Quad has the benefit of not really being anything. It's in the eye of the beholder. So,
Uh-huh. It's
it
not
can
that.
never fail because it doesn't have any milestones or
Uh-huh.
there's no metrics for success. I mean, the Quad's kind of three things at once, right? So the Quad primarily is the leaders level meeting. And that's where the four leaders get together and they kind of get into alignment on global issues, right? Normative alignment, and that's valuable. It doesn't produce deliverables, but I do think there's value in keeping the Indians in particular on side. We don't have to worry about whether or not we in Japan and Australia agree, but getting the Indians on side is valuable. Huge problem now because U.S.-India relations are at the worst point in 40 years.
Yeah.
And it's not at all clear that there will be a Quad leaders meeting this year. Um,
Oh, yeah.
the if of all the relationships that many of us in Washington thought were going to be rocky this year, Malaysia, for instance, we thought was going to be quite bad. It's actually okay. Nobody thought that the administration was going to choose to make India the punching bag for reasons that are still unclear to all of us. and to side with Pakistan, as if this is the early 2000s again, and we haven't learned any lessons. Um, and then you have the working group level of the Quad. So we've got these, I think now 6 work streams on global health and clean energy and space. And that's where the Quad was supposed to deliver public goods to the region, to the wider Indo-Pacific, in order to provide an alternative to China. That was where the Quad was supposed to like really rubber meets the road. We're going to prove that these 4 democracies working together can deliver as well as China. And they've not delivered a single thing of value. Their first big push was the vaccine facility during COVID. Unfortunately, that came way too late because the Delta wave hit India and India banned all exports of vaccines. And so by the time any Quad vaccines hit Southeast Asia, everybody already had access. So it didn't matter. And then the second was the Indo-Pacific Partnership for Maritime Domain Awareness, which was supposed to provide radio frequency detection, among other things, to help crack down on IUU fishing in the region. That's still out there. It was massively oversold, and most of the partners in South Asia and the Indian Ocean are disappointed by it, and the Pacific hasn't received it yet. So if you ask most governments in South Asia, what have you gotten from the Quad? They'll say nothing. We don't even know what the Quad's doing.
Huh.
And then the third is like the military side, which is not technically part of the Quad, but moves in parallel. So things like Operation Malabar every year. And that's still actually continuing. We are having regular quadrilateral naval exercises with the Indians. Um, so, that part I think is fine. And there's the bilateral US and India mill relationship which is moving forward. But the stuff that actually belongs under the Quad umbrella, I'm not so sure. I mean, I think it would be tragic if we don't have the leaders meeting this year and we lose that, but that's a possibility. AUKUS, I'm more optimistic. I mean, the US has launched this review. The biggest critic of AUKUS has been Elbridge Colby, the number 2 in the Pentagon, or number 3 in the Pentagon. But the Brits did their own review, the Aussies did their own review. They decided to keep it. The president and Rubio both said they're supportive of AUKUS. It has huge support on both sides of the aisle in Congress. Yes, the U.S. U.S. shipbuilding capacity is strained and getting worse, and so there's very valid questions about the ability of the U.S. to deliver the Collins class subs to Australia and the ones that we have for ourselves
Yeah.
in time for the first and second horizons of AUKUS. But there are, I think, very viable arguments made by defenders of AUKUS on both sides that actually the pretty significant now Australian investments into the U.S. shipbuilding industry, the industrial base, will come out as a net positive. That with that Australian money and financing, we will make more than we otherwise would have, particularly because the Aussies are going to open Stirling Naval Base to U.S. repair and retrofitting, so we can move some of the U.S. subs that are in line for maintenance. We've got something like a 2-year backlog for maintenance of the sub fleet here. If you can move some of those to Australia, then that frees up the U.S. shipyards to increase the production rate of the Collins, right? I'm not, our foremost defense industrial base expert at CSIS, but I find those arguments compelling, and I think if they can, kind of prove the math, it quiets a lot of the critics on AUKUS.
Yeah. Thanks. Great.
Wow, Greg, this is quite a comprehensive start. It went well beyond this question of US, China, and where Southeast Asia sees itself. So I thank you for really laying the groundwork for our entire year's worth of programs, because I think that's what you maybe unintentionally provided us with, and I am very grateful. We didn't even touch on the current sources of tension and conflict within Southeast Asia: protests in Indonesia, leadership change in Thailand, Thai Cambodia kerfuffles. So we have lots of things that we can invite you back for.
Yeah.
Well,
But
Thailand's on its fourth prime minister in just over a year. So by the time I come
yes,
back, they'll probably be on number 6.
exactly, exactly. So the relevance will continue. But please, on behalf of the rest of the committee, thank you so much for joining us and giving us your time and expertise. It was really valuable.
That was great, Greg. Thank you very much.
Thank
you.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah.
Really
Greg,
appreciate it.
indeed, you have given us, I wish, happier thoughts than what you're able to. Maybe when you come back, we'll have some things that go on the plus side. But anyway, thank you. I also want to invite our audience again to join us in 2 weeks on September 29 to meet Tom Latourette, who will speaking on the controversial topic of mining the seabed for critical minerals. As you know, there are environmental, geopolitical issues that are involved versus our strategic need for critical minerals and rare earths that we use in so many of the things and technologies, including defense and day-to-day living. And so the scramble, as you know, is strategic for the United States, and the rare earths and the critical minerals are in the seabed are looked as potential sources for these. So Tom, who is a senior physical engineer from RAND, is an expert in this field. He will be talking to us about this. He's just completed, which you will get information on when you register for this on deep sea mining, which was just completed by them. And we'll be including that report as it goes out. So please join us on the 29th for a topic we haven't talked about before, and we're now going to be going. We've been land-based. We've also looked at the sky. We're now going to be looking at the seabed. So thank you. And to all of you, we'll see you in a couple of weeks. And Greg, again, thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Greg.
Bye-bye.